All right. How awkward is this? Welcome back to WCHS. This is our first real class, and we're going to review what we did last week. I guess I should stand in front of the camera, otherwise, what am I doing, right? So the first thing we did last week was look at globalization, the concept, and I asked you to come up with a definition. And who has a definition for us? Yes?
Interconnectedness of mankind.
The interconnectedness of mankind. So if you only understand one thing about the entire course, that needs to be it. That's the building block. That's the cornerstone. That's where the course begins. Is globalization is the interconnectedness of mankind. And then the question that is a consequence of that is, how do we connect? How do we connect economically? How do we connect socially? How do we connect politically? Who can come up with an example of economic globalization? Economic globalization. Yes. Trade. So there are some countries that will have a competitive advantage or a comparative advantage. So Canada has a comparative advantage in growing wheat. Canada has a comparative advantage because we have natural gas and oil. Not every country has natural gas and oil. Not every country has a climate that is conducive to growing wheat. So Canada has a comparative advantage, and therefore we trade with others who have a comparative advantage growing something else. They might be growing something like bananas. Can I get you to look down at your notes for a second? See if you have the term comparative advantage, because I just mentioned it like 6 times. So when I repeat something like that, comparative advantage, even though this is review, it might be something to add to your notes. So a comparative advantage is why we trade. There'd be no need to trade if no country does better than what we do, and we do nothing better than them. If we're all the same at everything, then we wouldn't need to trade. But because there are some countries that have a different climate that will be conducive to other crops, then we have a comparative advantage or disadvantage. We grow wheat, they grow bananas. Comparative advantage. So we trade. Economics. How can economics have a positive effect on our lives? How is economic globalization a positive? Yes?
We get items we don't have.
So because of globalization, we have more variety. So consumers experience greater variety. And because of the variety, we may actually have a healthier diet. And as a consequence of that, we live longer. So globalization, economic globalization, can be a positive because it leads to longer lives. Leads to longer lives because we have a richer diet. We have a more varied diet. We can consume things that only grow thousands of kilometers away. So when you compare the life expectancy in 2020 with that of 1620, when globalization was much more limited, our lives and our life expectancy are longer now. Our life expectancy is longer because we have benefited from economic globalization, from trade, from a richer diet. So if you had been living in isolation in a village in Ireland, there would have been certain vitamins and minerals that weren't native to your area. But now the Irish get to trade with others. And suddenly you have Irish that get to enjoy tequila, and before they couldn't. So that's economic globalization. How might it be a negative thing? How might economic globalization be bad? So it can hurt local businesses. So we used to have here in Wetaskiwin Montgomery's General Store on Main Street. Now it's a museum because Walmart moved to town. So with economic globalization, you have transnationals. Transnational corporations are so large that they can do what is called predator pricing. They can price items so low that local stores cannot compete. And once those local stores are destroyed, then they might raise the prices up. So here in Wetaskiwin, we lost Montgomery's General Store, and each time communities lose those little stores, something unique about that community dies. When you go to a city and you're like, am I in Lacombe? Is this Wetaskiwin? Is this Camrose? I don't know, they all look the same. It's because of the death of local business at the hands of transnationals. That's the cost of globalization, is we have seen homogenization. We've seen the world become very vanilla, very bland, as a lot of the interesting local stuff is lost because it can't compete. Any other negative side of economic globalization? So maybe not here in Wetaskiwin, because we don't have industries like that, but in places like Indonesia, they might experience the negative side more directly. So I have my Nike shoes on, and somebody in Indonesia was paid 10 cents an hour to make these shoes for me. So one of the negative sides of globalization economically is sweatshops, exploitation of labor. That although my lifestyle seems better because of it, there are people that are enslaved so that I can live the life that I have. That there's people working in sweatshops, making my clothing. So a negative side is exploitation. So one of the common themes this year is that globalization is both positive and negative. And we will no doubt be writing essays about it. And we'll be looking at sources, and inside the source, we'll be looking for detail and trying to determine, to what extent is the source creator trying to have us reflect or embrace globalization, or should we reject globalization? We also talked about social globalization. Social globalization. Social is another dimension of globalization, and in 2020 it seems pretty powerful. What's an example of social globalization? Yes?
The Black Lives Matter movement.
Yeah, so hashtag Black Lives Matter. So living in Wetaskiwin, had this been 50 years ago, there'd be events happening around the world that would happen outside of our lens. We wouldn't see it. We wouldn't be aware of it. But because of the interconnectedness, and I would argue the hyper-connectedness, we are so connected with others, we're hyper-connected. Because of the hyper-connectedness of mankind, an individual may be pulled over in Wisconsin, or they may be pulled over or arrested in Minneapolis, and because of the events that happen, we may become more socially charged and demanding justice here in Wetaskiwin. So Black Lives Matter is an example of social globalization as we try to influence change and create justice throughout the world. And looking at our community is not immune to injustice. That Wetaskiwin has generations of lack of social justice to wrestle with. So we may become even more infected with this revolutionary change. And we'll see how that changes our community. So social globalization, it can be a positive because it can create necessary change. Equality for women, equality for ethnic minorities. But it could also be seen as a negative thing if the path to that equality becomes so volatile that civilization itself begins to be destroyed. How much looting, how much murder can be justified? So, we had you look at a cartoon in the textbook, beginning in chapter 3, on page 66. And I asked you to try to find the ideological perspective of the source. So in social 10, 11, and 12, whenever we do source interpretation, which is called an assignment 1, whenever we do an A1, we're going to be looking at the ideological perspective of the source. Ideological perspective of the source just means, what does this person think? What are they thinking about globalization? So when you look at that cartoon on page 66, do you get the impression globalization is something we should reflect and celebrate? It's good, it's made our lives better? Or does it make it look like globalization something that's bad, that we need to reject because it's made our lives dystopian? It's made our lives limited, flawed. So, you did this at the end of class last week. How many people thought that this cartoon was celebrating globalization? Nobody did. So if I was going to say that this said it celebrates globalization, I would say that the cartoon is showing how we are connected through technology. And although the technology is being shown very generally on page 66, we could assume that as a consequence of these connections, there's been some benefit to people's lives. These wires that connect us make it possible for you to talk to your family that live in other countries. So maybe your grandma lives in Italy, maybe your grandma lives in Portugal. You don't get to see her much, but because of technology, you can see her every day. So we can infer. Infer is a good tool when you're analyzing sources. We can infer that there's a reason why people might celebrate what's on this page. That those people looking to celebrate globalization would say that as a consequence of this network of technology, we can connect with loved ones around the world. Keep our family strong. That's a family connection. We could say that others would celebrate this because economically, this network of technology that we see on this page is what allows us to do global business. And there are people that are excited about global business because the larger the market base, the larger the profit potential. So companies like Tesla, they can't be as innovative if they can only sell cars to people in one state or one nation. Tesla can be more innovative if they have a larger market to sell to. So because of the globalized market, Tesla is able to invest more in research and development and try to propel us into that futuristic world that we all dream of. Well, maybe not all, but many do. So, futurists might look at this and celebrate it and say, this is why we're able to dream of a better future, is because of the network of connections we've made have created an economy of scale where Elon Musk and others at Tesla can dedicate billions every year to trying to create a new reality. Others might look at it and see hope, that this is why social justice may become global. It's because we're connected, we might be able to spread ideas that are necessary. So, one way to look at the source is to say people might look at it and celebrate globalization. But there's reasons to look at it and say, I don't think that's what the cartoonist wanted though. How do we know that the cartoonist is actually rejecting globalization? What elements within the cartoon? What details within the cartoon say, because the cartoonist drew it as this, I know that he or she meant globalization's bad. Yes?
Not all the plugs are actually plugged into things, and not every outlet has something plugged in.
Absolutely. So, being that some wires are not plugged in, and some outlets have nothing plugged in at all, we're seeing gaps in the network. So, the cartoonist is trying to expose gaps in our globalized network, saying that globalization is working for some people, but not everyone. That there's areas with nothing plugged into it. What might those areas be? Are those areas New York City? Is that area Paris or London? Where in the world might technology or globalization not have plugged in yet? Who's disadvantaged because they're not as plugged in? These things are really itchy, eh? Like, I'm just constantly itchy. Yes?
People in Indonesia who work 10 cents an hour.
Yeah, so maybe they're plugged in, but plugged in a bad way, right? So they're plugged in, they're connected to me, but they're making 10 cents an hour. So they, unfortunately, globalization has come to them, but it has created some inequality for them. But there's places in the world where they're living very traditional lifestyles still. They might be surviving on very limited income. So we call that the developing world. It's still developing. It's not developed yet. It's still developing. So in the developing world, you may still have extreme poverty because globalization hasn't come to them yet. So the cartoonist could be saying globalization is still flawed because it's not equally distributed. That there's areas that are haves and areas that are have-nots. And we call that word disparity. I feel like I'm going to write that on the board for some reason. So disparity means have and have not, means rich and poor. And I would argue that the cartoon on page 66 is showing disparity. It's showing a technological gap. So we're seeing a technological gap. That some people call a digital divide. So to personalize what a digital divide is, let me show you my cell phone. If I even brought it. Huh. Oh, there it is. It's so small, it's easy to misplace. People will see it and be like, man, is that like an iPhone 3 or an iPhone 4? That thing's tiny. I'm on the wrong side of the digital divide. I'm a have-not. I have not the latest technology. You might bring out your cell phone and it looks more like an iPad. It's huge, it's beautiful. It's cutting edge. So the cartoon is exposing the fact that we're not all equal. We're not all equally benefiting from globalization. Some have access to newer technology, some don't. I'm somewhere in the middle. I still have a phone. There's still billions of people in the world that don't even have a cell phone. So at least I have a cell phone. But in terms of cell phones, this is not that impressive. So that's a digital divide. That's disparity. That's have and have not. And the cartoonist is exposing that. The cartoonist is showing us that globalization has really benefited some people in the developed world, but it hasn't benefited everyone. And we also have one last term that could be used here, the 1% and the 99%. This theory that globalization is really only served the interests of the ultra elite and they control the world. So this year we'll be talking about the 1% and the 99% and the exploitation that is involved in that relationship. So before we wrap up the intro from last week, I know there's some notes that you took last week that I didn't cover. So who wants to point out another brilliant observation about globalization from last week? What else do you have down in your notes that we didn't cover? Yes?
That the coronavirus may be a result of globalization.
Yeah, so there have been viruses in the past, but this pandemic spread quite quickly, and it has, infected more than 200 nations in the world. So the coronavirus and the rapid spreading of it is evidence of the negative side of globalization. Yes? I would say it's part of economic globalization and social, the fact that because we trade, while we trade, we get infected. I'm not saying that the coronavirus came on this beautiful camera that was made in China, but the more connected we are with trade, the more human-to-human contact we have, the more likely it is the virus does spread. Any other observations from last week that we need to reiterate? So we talked about ethnic globalization. We talked about the idea that you belong to a collective identity that is your ethnicity. So I'm, Irish Canadian. So another aspect or dimension of globalization is cultural, is ethnic. Anybody have any questions about last week? So I'm going to hit stop of this video because that's the end of the review. We'll probably do another review at the end of today's class to sum up the new stuff that we learned today. But I have an activity for you, an assignment. You're going to go through chapter 1 of the textbook and look at the difference between collective and individual identities. So I want you to try to figure out what is the difference between a collective identity and an individual identity. And under what circumstances is it better to have a collective? When would it be better to force a collective identity upon the people? And under what circumstances is it better to have an individual identity? When would an individual identity lead to a richer life? So it's really just going over chapter 1 and having you think about the difference between collective and individual identity, thinking about when would it be better to have one over the other. This will give you a chance to do something while I stop the video and post the video, and it should only take us like 10 minutes. So you're skimming through chapter 1, looking at the difference between collective and individual identity, and trying to figure out when would it be better to have one over the other.
I do not have a textbook.
Can I get you to go to the Learning Commons and get one?
Sure. Where's that?
That's the library.
Okay.
So it's right on the other side of this concrete wall, but you have to go all the way around to the library. You can also go there, yeah. All right, let me stop talking.
I just got an email.
All right, where did my act presenter go? Control element.